The horrors that we've seen in the modern world, horrors like the Holocaust, like a form of racism that drove slavery, skin color based racism itself, horrors like the impending threat of nuclear apocalypse and genocide occurring again and again. These horrors were not accidents in the modern West. These horrors were determined, they were necessitated by the philosophy that we gave birth to a few centuries ago. Showing the link between this philosophy, how we understand reason, how we understand reality, and the horrors that it led to, was perhaps the primary goal of the first chapter of my Tyranny of the Banal. It's vitally important for me to show that, because unless we can oppose this philosophy, these kind of horrors will happen again and again. And believe me, this philosophy is ambient within our culture. It is the philosophy we train our children in our schools, and to a large extent in our universities. It's also a philosophy that is a solvent of the Christian faith. Where it grows, the Christian faith will die. So detailing the philosophy and how it leads to these horrors, this was the primary goal of chapter 1 of the Tyranny of the Banal. I wanted to show it so that I could show in chapter 2 the Christian alternative, and then in the 3 pivotal chapters, when we look at moral questions surrounding sexuality, surrounding death and dying, surrounding abortion, I wanted to show these 2 philosophies competing. I wanted to show how these 2 philosophies shape 2 very different perspectives in relation to these questions. So, in this overview of the first chapter of the Tyranny of the Banal, I want to get into this philosophy. I want to tell the story of how it emerged and tell the story of how it led to the kind of horrors that we've seen far too often in the last few centuries. Colonialism, skin color-based racism, indeed the Holocaust. Once I can show this, I can then, in chapter 2, show the Catholic Christian alternative. So I appreciate you clicking on this link. I appreciate you watching this video. Some of what will follow will get pretty philosophical, pretty deep into the weeds of the last few hundred years of philosophical thinking. But please do journey with me as we make our way through the Tyranny of the Banal, and work with me as we attempt to build a Catholic Christian alternative to the tyranny that has led to such horrors in the last few centuries. There are many ways of telling the story about how certain philosophical developments led to the horrors we saw in the 20th century, led to the horrors we saw in the age of colonialism. In fact, what we have really is a number of tributaries leading into this ocean, this secular ideology which drives some of these pathologies. My goal in chapter 1 of the Tyranny of the Banal was simply to look at one of these tributaries, to tell the story of one of these genealogies which gave birth to some of the horrors we see in the modern West. And one of the great ironies about the tributary that I chose is that the main figure involved in this, Immanuel Kant, was striving in many ways to do the opposite of what his philosophy actually led to. He wanted to safeguard reason. He wanted to safeguard the notion of God. He wanted to establish a firm foothold for philosophy, for thinking, for morality. And sadly, what his philosophy led to was the destruction of all of these things. So, how does this story go? How do we tell the story about how Kantian perspectives fueled modern Western perspectives on reason and on reality, which crippled our capacity to see the presence of God in the natural order, which crippled our capacity to see dignity in people and in creation itself, which encouraged us to develop certain ways of thinking, which led to unbridled capitalism, which led to skin color based racism, and which led to horrors like genocide. Let's start at the beginning of that story, a very famous, perhaps even cliched beginning, when Immanuel Kant is roused from his dogmatic slumbers by what's happening in the work of people like David Hume. David Hume suggested that we can't know anything with certainty apart from necessary logical correlations. So, for example, if A is heavier than B and B is heavier than C, then we can know that A is heavier than C simply through the relation of these things. Apart from that, we can't really know anything. Yes, everyone around him was suggesting that we can know based upon experience, not based upon the outdated notions of dogmatism. The Bible says this, religious tradition or authority says that. Not based on those things, but based on experience, things that you can see and touch and feel. Well, David Hume wasn't even too certain about that. He was very much aware that when we use reason to try and express what we've experienced or understand what we've experienced, we will make mistakes and we will posit causal relationships on things that are only proximate to one another. And so, for example, you see me right now clicking my fingers and you hear a noise. But it's quite possible that I'm not clicking my fingers at all and that the noise you heard was something I've superimposed later on. And so you were experiencing me clicking my fingers when in reality I wasn't clicking my fingers. I was only doing this and a noise was being added later on. So your experience in that example lied to you. So we can't even trust our experience, says David Hume. Yes, John Locke says that all knowledge are marks made by experience on a tabula rasa. George Berkeley says, esse est percipi, to be is to be perceived. We can only know what we can experience, what we can perceive, but David Hume says we can't even trust this experience. And so if our knowledge of reality is based on experience and we can't trust it, then what is reality? How can we know anything? This really is the fundamental question in modern Western philosophy. I don't mean contemporary Western philosophy. I mean a form of Western philosophy that we will locate in the 1500s, the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, and so on and so forth. Descartes will say, how do I even know that I am? How do I even know that I exist? And he says, well, I know I exist because there's has to be something thinking, do I exist? And so this thinking thing, I think, therefore I am this thinking thing, this res cogitan, this thinking thing. How do I even know that this isn't a dream? That some demon isn't forcing me to see this as reality when it's not? This is the fundamental question. And Immanuel Kant, in the rubble of what David Hume leaves, because David Hume inherits from rationalists a belief in reason, and he in many ways takes a sledgehammer to it. So how can I know what is real? How can I trust my rational inquiries? How can I know what is right or wrong? How can we build a society? So Kant is faced with the specter of a world in which there is no truth. And so this world that Nietzsche will later insist upon, things making their own realities, things living with a different morality, Kant has too much hope for civilization. He has too much hope for societies. He has too much hope for humanity to succumb to this. He wants to build something else. He wants to say, no, there is reason, and no, there is God, and no, there is morality. And the way he did it, in many ways, is the way that we have inherited doing it. But it's a way which doesn't work and which leads to other horrors. So how does Immanuel Kant do this? what is it that Immanuel Kant says in relation to Hume? Well, he will say, I agree, David Hume, yes. Knowledge, of course, is experience. And John Locke is right that this experience makes marks on a blank slate, but for Kant, the slate isn't entirely blank. And here's the basis of his riposte to Hume. We experience the world for Kant, but we all experience the world in similar ways. That's crazy. How can this be the case? Surely we know we don't all experience the world in similar ways. Well, Kant says we all experience the world in similar ways in that we're all bound by similar limits, similar categories outside of which we can't experience. So, for example, we naturally will think in terms of space. You know, the universe, for example, is expanding right now. Think of a balloon just expanding out. And we can't think what's on the other side of the edge of that balloon because we don't have the capacity to think non-spatially. We think in terms of time. We plot things on a temporal framework and we posit this happened then, and that was before then, and this was after then. Our brain will naturally categorize things on a temporal framework. And so too, of course, what am I using to communicate with you right now? I'm using words, I'm using language. For Kant, we can only think through language. Yes, we can experience and have sensations, but as soon as we try and think about those sensations in the absence of the actual sensation, we must use signs to think about those sensations or those experiences. We have to put words on them in order to work with the experience or the perception in the absence of that immediate perception. So everybody, so you and me and everybody in the world is limited by these limits that we cannot transcend, these transcendental limits that bind us all. And so Kant says, yeah, sure, we might not be able to know reality in itself, but we can know what we experience because we will all experience in similar ways in that we can't experience outside the limits that we all find ourselves within. Now, this is absolutely crucial. This is the key. This is the way that everybody, you were trained, I was trained, we're all trained to work with experience processed to transcendental limits. So, for example, it may be the case that this dog or that cat is in relationship with God, but in your school or your university, you're not going to talk about this. Why? Because that's outside the limits of what can be experienced. We don't see that relationship between God and the dog or the cat. We only see the dog or the cat. Therefore, we can process this experience as long as we bracket out any questions that can't be answered, like what is the dog in itself? Das stinging sick. What is the thing in itself? We can only work out what it is for me. And so you're positing something outside these transcendental limits. You're positing something outside the boundaries of phenomenal experience, and we can only work with what is in phenomenal experience. This word phenomena basically means stuff as it appears to me, stuff that is experienceable, as opposed to the noumena, the thing in itself, which is outside our field of vision. So what's happening here is that the real world is being reduced to our perception. The real world is being reduced to that which can be quantified, to that which can be measured. In this shift, Kant is one of a whole host of different thinkers that are shifting our understanding of reality from something which involved that which could be experienced and measured and quantified, and stuff which could not be experienced or quantified or measured, to things that are exclusively quantifiable, measurable, and experienceable. This is the reality that we will work with. Science will work with this, of course, but also the humanities. Also, reason itself will work with this. And if reason tries to work in relation to things that can't be measured or quantified or aren't shared, then it's not reason at all. It's faith, it's the irrational, it's superstition. And so notice all these binaries that are coming into being between faith and reason, between that is measurable and quantifiable and that which is simply superstition. These binaries didn't exist beforehand. Beforehand, yes, there was reason that we could be certain about. There was reason that we could measure and quantify. And this science, this science, this form of knowledge was good knowledge. Aristotle said it was good. Aquinas said it was good. Ibn Sina, the Islamic philosopher and mathematician and polymath, said it was good. But then for them, reason can also operate in relation to lots of other stuff. Reason was broad. Reality was broad. We'll cover things we can be certain about and things we can't be certain about at all. So, for example, we can never know if a war is just for Thomas Aquinas with certainty. And yet we can't simply say, well, that's just superstition, that's just opinion. We have to reason as best we can about it and act as best we can about it, even though we can never be certain. Now again, for Kant, reason operates only in relation to things that are within these limits. Things that can have certainty as at least their aspiration. This is the goal. In the preface to the second edition of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, he says that certainty is the goal that all rational activity aspires to. Not all rational activity will reach it, but if it can't be a goal, then the activity isn't rational. You know, when someone like Richard Dawkins, the new atheist, now the old atheist, when he talks about God and flying spaghetti monsters, you know, to a person of faith, that's a bizarre combination. But it's perfectly solid if you have this absolute binary. Things that are experienceable, things that are measurable and quantifiable, that's reason, and then all other stuff. Loch Ness Monster, Santa Claus, Flying Spaghetti Monster, God. Now you could also say love. You could also say human rights. You could also say beauty. All these things are robbed of their reality. They're robbed of their significance. They're robbed of their meaningfulness by this binary. Why doesn't it work? It doesn't work because everybody knows that there is more reality than that which is commonly experienced. Everybody believes in things like human rights and love and various forms of equality, even if we can't measure it and quantify it. We all believe that reality is more than that which is measurable or quantifiable, and that things like love and human rights and the concept of justice itself is something other than our own construction, that these things have reality. And so we all know that the world isn't the way the modern West pretends it is. But there's also, and here's the problem, there's also horrors associated with this form of thinking. Why? Because in reducing reality to what is measurable, to what is quantifiable, what we do is we will seek to assess a person based upon things that are measurable and quantifiable. Let me explain this. This is actually a key point and a key point in the first chapter of my Tyranny of the Banal. Augustine will ask the question, are various kinds of people all possessed of dignity? And he says, yes, absolutely. Now, who's he talking about? Well, Augustine believed there was certain people who just had a sort of a head and a chest on one big leg. The skiapods, he called them. One big leg and one big foot, and they bounced around, and they exist in some parts of the world. There are other people with dog-like heads. There are other people whose heads was in the middle of their chest, and even conjoined twins he lumps in as these mythical creatures that we know exist, although he's never seen them. Now, for him, they have a dignity because their dignity rests on God's love for them. They're not reducible to their attributes, to that which can be seen or touched or felt. They're not reducible to that which can be measured and quantified, because God's love for them, which we can't see, is the basis for their dignity. Hildegard of Bingen will say the same thing about the natural order, that trees have a dignity not because of any element or attribute they have, but because of God's love for them. And God's love for them is not, for Augustine and Hildegard, God's love for them is not simply God's emotion vis-a-vis them. God's love is the Holy Spirit. God's love is we'll come to this in chapter 2. God's love is part of God's self, and so God's presence is there in trees and in people, albeit to the differing degrees. And this is the basis of the dignity of people and indeed the natural order. Now that gets broken. That gets rejected. All that stuff has got to be bracketed. It's got to be placed outside of our rational reflection. And to understand a person, we can only understand the things that will submit to common shared experience. And so all of a sudden, and this, if you remember one thing from this video, please just remember this thing. All of a sudden, someone's skin color becomes not simply significant, but perhaps the most significant thing, as the clearest phenomenological data. Remember this one thing. In all the texts that we have, from the Christian era, from before the Christian era, all the texts we have from then, the letters, the sermons, the books, the speeches, the plays, everything, all those, until this time period, the time period of the French Revolution and after, the time period of the early modern world, the late medieval world. Again, this is a long time period I'm talking about, but these are trajectories we have from the Renaissance. From all the texts up to that time period, there isn't one which says that person A is better than person B because of the color of their skin. There's not one that says person A is worse than person B because of the color of their skin. Because what the hell has the color of one's skin got to do with anything? Well, in the modern world, based upon modern philosophy, based upon the reduction of what is real to that which can be experienced, now this is the truth of the thing. What is measurable, what is quantifiable. And all of a sudden, texts which say that person A is better or worse than person B because of the color of their skin gets more and more and more and more and more plentiful. Now, all of a sudden, if vast swathes of people haven't reached the scientific level of these other people, and these people have different obvious phenomenological differences, for example, skin color, then this culture, this philosophy will say that these people are less good than these people. This is what happens in the modern West. It's not that people have always been shitty racists. No, people were always shitty, but they weren't shitty skin color based racists because they couldn't reduce reality to something like skin color before. This was a philosophical shift. This was a shift that comes with a particular era, the era which gives us an understanding of reason and reality that we still teach in schools, that we still teach in universities. And it drives the idea that person B is inferior to person A because of the color of their skin. In fact, they may not be fully human. Why? Because what does it mean to be human? For Augustine, it's God's love for the person, whether they've got one big head in the middle of their chest or not. Now, well, it's based upon their attributes that are measurable and quantifiable. What happens if these people don't have particularly scientific developments that we would associate with higher learning? Well, what happens is these people and their territories are considered fair game. These people and their territories and their livelihoods and their bodies are considered fair game. Colonialism always happened. Normans would rampage into Ireland. They wouldn't say that the Irish were a different race or different species because look at their hair colour is different. Now after the Enlightenment, they do. After the Enlightenment, we can see letters from British clergymen in Ireland saying, on my journey I saw people who were halfway between me and a chimp. And you can tell that by their facial structure, that they're just a different race, a different species. And so colonialism now becomes completely different. Colonialism now becomes based not on the simple greed for this other person's land. It becomes seen as, well, the white man's burden to bring civilization to these inferior races. This is a horror which is not an accident. This is a horror which is established on the basis of an approach to reality and reason that is still taught in schools. That is, let's reduce reality to things that is observable, quantifiable, measurable, and shared between us. We have the same philosophy. We hope for a different outcome. This is a philosophy that breeds an understanding of the natural order, which robs it of its dignity. Remember, Hildegard of Bingen holds that the natural order is infused by the presence of God. Well, this is superstitious mumbo-jumbo. From the modern perspective, we can only understand the natural order as it is phenomenologically, as it is in terms of my experience of it. And I can think of it as firewood. I could think of it as artistic inspiration. I could think of it as something that would be good for building boats. I could think of it in a whole host of ways. But in all these ways, I'm thinking about it in terms of what it means to me. I'm thinking about it as a commodity. And so the natural order, based upon this philosophical development, is reduced to a commodity. Capitalism, savage capitalism, which sees the world simply as resource, not as touched by the presence of God, but simply as resource, is demanded by this philosophical understanding. And the environmental crisis, savage capitalism, racism, all these things flow from that, even genocide. Again, it's impossible to commit genocide against a group of people that you think are loved by God and have dignity. You have to first interpret them as non-human. And there are no accounts that we can find in the medieval world of people scientifically, rationally, coherently arguing that different people are somehow non-human. But this shift comes with the idea that a person's identity is established by phenomenological categories, and these people may not have the phenomenological categories which establish them as human. And so take, for example, the horrors of medieval anti-Semitism. Let's say there is a horrific pogrom taking place in a small town in Germany in the year 1339. Well, if someone is attacking a Jewish person and saying, I hate you, and then they have all these conspiracy theories, you poisoned the water, you attacked children, you did whatever, and we're now going to persecute all the Jewish people. Well, Jewish people could go, okay, I convert to Christianity. Now again, this is horrific, but note, they could convert to Christianity and everything would be fine. Again, horrific, but what it shows is that the person who is persecuting them does not see that there is any physiological or ontological brutality in this person. That the problem is to do with their faith or something of this nature. Now roll that forward from 1339 to 1939. And there is a persecution of Jewish person. Could a Jewish person then say, no, it's okay, I convert? Well, the Nazi would say, no. Scientifically, you were a different species. Scientifically, you were a different kind of thing. And then the genocide is fueled by this. Even Hutus, Tutsis, all these cases of mass extermination are based on a curious pseudoscience that is pseudo in the sense that we say it's wrong, but when we say it's wrong, we mean it's intellectually deficient, but it's also morally wrong. But it is scientia in the sense of it is a reduction of reality to physiological properties. It is a reduction of reality to that which is experienceable, measurable, and quantifiable that's driving the horrors. Environmental catastrophe, colonialism, racism, skin color-based racism, skin color-based slavery. These things are predicated on these philosophical shifts, two different understandings of reason and reality. And that's what I wanted to show in chapter 1. I wanted to show, as I say, that these two perspectives are like Carthage and Rome. Cato saw that Carthage and Rome were two fundamentally interconnected realities. Where one goes, the other will shrink. Where one shrinks, the other will grow. And so Cato knew that for Rome to survive, Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. The fact of the matter is that this understanding of reason and the real, where it grows, Christianity will decline. And Christianity must grow by out-narrating, by offering an alternative to this understanding of reality. So in chapter 2, which we'll be looking at next week, I want to show what the Catholic Christian understanding of reason and reality is. I want to talk about the doctrine of God, the doctrine of Jesus Christ, the doctrine of the Holy Spirit, and look at how that frames an altogether different understanding of reality, or a different understanding of reason. And then, equipped with these two different understandings of reality and reason, I want to show how in contemporary moral questions we see these two perspectives interrelating. And then in the final chapter, I'll talk about how we can rebuild a Catholic Christian moral imagination. Because without that, even if it calls itself Christian, if it's based upon an understanding of reason and reality that is inherently secular, even if it calls itself Christian, the horrors will continue. I'm not suggesting that we can overcome all bad stuff in the world by simply changing our philosophical assumptions. But I am suggesting that the horrors of the last few centuries were unprecedented in human history. They were unprecedented in human history. Remember, in the Second World War, the good guys, we will all accept that the good guys were the Allies, that the good guys were committed rationally, not as an hysterical response, but rationally to turning the air to fire in Hamburg, in Dresden. The air was turned to fire when the German soldiers were away in the front, and so who were being burned to death were children and women primarily. And this was a strategy. This was a rational decision. Now, the greatest horrors of the medieval period, we think of the sack of Jerusalem or the sack of Constantinople. This is rage-filled and hysterical. This isn't Harry Truman deciding to annihilate an entire city's population by dropping an atomic bomb on Hiroshima or on Nagasaki. This is the product of a different moral imagination. And these were the good guys. These are the heroes of our age who did these things. So my point is that we've seen unprecedented horrors, and these unprecedented horrors are based upon an understanding of reason and reality. And in the Tyranny of the Banal, I want to show that understanding of reason and reality, delenda est, must be destroyed.